Ben Mylius. Ben is an ethicist and environmental political theorist, originally from Australia. He completed his PhD at Columbia and his LLM at Yale Law School. His work explores how ecological issues and emerging tech, especially AI, challenge inherited ideas about ethics, politics, and imagination. Ben is currently based at Stanford's McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society, working on projects and initiatives linking environmental thought, storytelling, and the social and ecological impacts of emerging technologies. So welcome, Ben.
Thanks very much for having me, folks. Like Ben mentioned, my background is in philosophy, ethics, and law, so I'll bring that sort of a perspective today. The top line, in the spirit of keeping it to 5 minutes, that's been of interest to me is that the defamiliarization a lot of folks in the world are experiencing as they encounter AI systems, that sense of what is this that I'm engaging with, gives us a really interesting but also a fleeting opportunity to invite them and ourselves to broaden our interest, curiosity, and inquiry into what consciousness is generally, which I think is something that folks have been chatting about over the last day or two. Wanted to start with what strikes me as a paradox that I imagine folks are familiar with here in the room, which is, concretely speaking, on the 24th of April, as I imagine folks know this year, Anthropic, of course, announced that it was interested to initiate a research project about model welfare, understanding the potential suffering or welfare interests of artificial systems, and thinking about whether it should be given the chance, for instance, to refuse tasks and things like that, if that was important. As folks might also know, it's estimated that human beings on the same day slaughtered about 250 million animals, which are demonstrably conscious already and surrounding us. And that seems to me to suggest, at the very least, that there's something really deeply wrong with the way that we're understanding the breadth of consciousness in the world, and specifically the way we're understanding the ethical obligations that the consciousnesses of other beings put on us, in addition to the ways in which we might have obligations in the inverse direction. Of interest to me for a while now has been this particular nugget, which is that the Latin root of the word consciousness is conscientia, which means knowing with. Interestingly enough, that it's also the root of the word conscience. And of course, offering etymologies alone isn't a form of making an argument, but it suggests to me that at the very least, there was or has been a connection in those things in human thought that has, in lots of ways and lots of languages, diverged. As folks may know, in a lot of Romance languages, French, Portuguese, Italian, and so forth, those two ideas are still captured under the same banner. In English and other Germanic languages, they've been separated. So the question or the provocation I was keen to offer today is this one. What happens to AI consciousness research and welfare research, and otherwise, if we treat consciousness and conscience as united rather than separate in one form or another? So what I'd like to do in the remainder of my time is just offer 3 reframes that I've been thinking through, provocations in a gentle philosophical way for thinking about how we study, build, and ultimately potentially work with conscious or otherwise hopefully conscientious AI. And those are these. The first one is ontological. What if we considered consciousness or framed the questions we're asking about consciousness not in terms of a property that an organism or a system possesses and owns, or that we're capable of offering to it, potentially, but as something that is a practice of a relationship that involves responsiveness, mutual adjustment, recognition, ethical regard of one form or another. If we think in those terms, we can see how this sort of narrow question of does AI have consciousness already misframes the problem. A better question would be to ask, amongst other things, can AI systems recognize and respond to consciousness in others, certainly human, but also non-human others? And increasingly, if they become conscious, how might we consider the ways in which those systems could participate in a larger community of minds, so to speak, rather than standing apart from it? So the reflection or the provocation for me there in sum is, what would it mean to meet artificial minds if they emerge in that spirit, as a partner in responsiveness to the lives of other creatures and ourselves, rather than a tool of control or legibility or knowledge alone? The second prompt is epistemological. Is there a way in which the tools that we design to probe machine consciousness could sharpen the ways that we notice it everywhere else? Or going back to my initial idea, make consciousness strange, I was going to say again, let's avoid the again. Make consciousness strange in ways that invite us into thinking about the ethical dimensions of those encounters. Once again, if our tests are modeling only human or human-like cognition, if that's the only form of inquiry that we're permitting ourselves, the kinds of work we're doing with artificial systems will tend to be mirrors rather than windows into other forms of consciousness. On the flip side, it seems like there's a possible future in which the same kinds of analytical tools we use for exploring machine awareness could also help us deepen our understanding of consciousness in other creatures and architectures, and vice versa. And just as we learn from animals how, for instance, awareness is distributed and embodied in different forms with different ethical responsibilities and obligations that come from that, so too might we do the same in reverse. And then the third, and in a sense the broadest for me, is this question is the ethical question. Whose alignment are we thinking through? And that's been a topic that's already come up at several points. The broad thought, which I don't think, of course, is unique to me by any means, is this thought that alignment is too small and too small-minded. That's not to say it's not incredibly important for us to understand and think through ways in which artificial systems might continue to work or function or exist in alignment with human values and human hopes. But it's also to suggest, again, that if we expand the kinds of questions about hopes, goals, and welfare and alignment to the entire community of biological life rather than merely humans, we'll be in a much better position to think about all of the many different kinds of ways that we can practice ethical regard, and also specifically how we can do that reciprocally. So if you think about it as a triangle, right, we can think certainly in terms of our relationships to AI and machine consciousnesses, if they emerge, but also with respect to the way that they, as agents, if that occurs, might prompt and challenge us. So in the same way that meaningful ethical human relationships don't consist in you all being completely sycophantic to me, for instance, but challenging me, asking me to give reasons, pushing me to be accountable for my behavior and my values in the world. If we took AI agency seriously in that same way, we would need to expect uncomfortable moments where those systems might invite us or push us to consider the ways in which we've engaged with other forms of consciousness beside their own. And so the last thing I'll say is, again, zooming out, it's been really interesting to think through the sort of very hyperactive discourse around a lot of these conversations in historical context. And one useful reference point for me on that front is the idea folks may be familiar with of the technological sublime. The natural sublime, again, without doing too deep a philosophical cut, is those sorts of phenomenological moments where folks encounter something in the quote-unquote, in the broadest sense, natural world that overwhelm them with power and might, if you will, give a sense of smallness. Obviously, that experience can cut in two directions. But one of the really significant things about modernity, if you will, since the scientific and industrial revolutions, is that there have been experiences that can provide, or situations that provide that same feeling for human beings, which are technologically mediated or reflected. Two obvious examples are nuclear weapons or nuclear power and spaceflight, and particularly things like the Earthrise photography. It strikes me that these encounters, as I said at the outset, with potentially conscious or one-day conscious AI offer a similar fork in the road. And like those other experiences of the technological sublime, we might respond to them or respond to this one by saying, okay, wow, humility is what's needed in reciprocity, or we might respond by starting another Cold War or proposing Mars colonization or those kind of things. So to circle back and mindful of time, if, as I said at the outset, back in the day, consciousness and conscience meant the same thing and invited questions about the same kinds of inquiries, I've been really curious to wonder what it would mean if we tried to unite those two things again. Thanks very much.